Okay, thank you so much everyone for coming in person. I know it's the beginning of reading week for most of you if you're SOAS students as well, so it does mean a great deal. Welcome to the Middle East Treaty Organization's event in collaboration with the SOAS Influencing Corridors of Power project. We are going to be discussing reorienting Western perspectives on WMD disarmament in the Middle East. This wonderful event has been co-organized by our two brilliant University Network volunteers, Zemal and Alice, who are also students at UCL and SOAS, respectively. And they're also joined by our speakers today, Dr. Seyed Ali Alavi, who is a senior teaching fellow at SOAS in the Near and Middle East section of the School of Languages, Cultures and Linguistics. And he is also a member of SOAS ICOP project. And also by Sharon, Dolev and Emad Kiyaei, who are both our co-directors of the Middle East organization. So with that, I'm going to hand over to our speakers today who can get started. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. As Anita introduced me, I'm Zemal. I study comparative literature. I'm a third-year student at University College London, and I'm part of the METO University project.
Hi, I know a few of us know me. I'm Alicia. I study International Relations and Arabic at SOAS. I'm second year, and I'm also part of the University Network of METO. This is a very nice experience for university students to get to know more about what METO is about, what it works for, which is establishing a WMD free zone in the Middle East. There are plenty of opportunities for students, fortunately, and yeah, I think we can get started with our speakers.
Thank you, our great students at SOAS. It's a privilege to deliver a speech for you. Let's start with weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. It's a very important topic. You may find it very useful in your future career as well. But when we need to start when we say Middle East. The Western media, what comes to your mind is Iranian nuclear dossier and nothing else. In all the media, as you can see. But when you look at it, the nuclear dossier of the Middle East started from 1960s. And the Western powers have pledged not to talk about this until 1990s, when Iran started to work on its nuclear research program. When it started in 1960s, when Israel started to, blessed by the superpowers and the Western governments, provided with the technology and the science, managed to establish one of the most sophisticated nuclear arsenal. 1987, an Israeli nuclear researcher, he also, Mordechai Vanunu, he revealed that to the Sunday Times newspaper, and he was imprisoned for 18 years, 11 years in solitary confinement, explaining the sophistication of the nuclear arsenal, not nuclear, also research, nuclear arsenal. This is something we say secret open case, and everyone can find out about that. But a very good colleague has written an amazing article, Professor Clive Williams in Australian International Institute of International Relations, about the estimation that's saying that Israel possesses possibly more than 90 sophisticated nuclear warheads. And United States Secretary of State Colin Powell estimated in 2016 something around 100 to 200 anyhow. And also equipped and supported by sophisticated ballistic missiles, Jericho 3, which has got 4,000 kilometers of range, literally well beyond the Middle Eastern countries, and sophisticated submarines, Dolphin diesel electric fueled, which can carry more than 50 within 8 submarines, 50 nuclear warheads. Any capitals in Europe and anywhere in the world can be targeted. So, having said that, when we come back again in the Middle East, the other state will be Iran and the rest of the Middle Eastern countries. There has been any kind of IAEA inspections for Israel. Has never been any discussion about taking the country into accountability or having any scrutiny committee to see the reasons for having such sophisticated nuclear arsenal. On the other side of the spectrum, you have Iran, the country that started with basic facilities in Iran, which was actually goes back to 1970s when Iran had a friendly system towards the West, and then had a hiccup and stopped it, paused it, and then thinking about bringing nuclear energy and nuclear science into it, connecting it to electricity, or so on and so forth, and signing contracts with Japan, with Germany, with France, with none of them delivered. And later on, IAEA came, and Iran is a member of NPT, non-proliferation treaty, and also routinely inspected. We went through JCPOA. I'm not going to explain that so much, you know it, but it was 2015, which Iran agreed with the international community and United States and EU and United Kingdom and Russia and China and the rest of the world to put CCTVs there, and even invite the world to put investment and buy some shares of the nuclear scientific research or plants, which has been literally paralyzed by President Trump withdrawing from JCPOA. Literally here, the last point is that when Abraham Accord was signed between Israel, United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, and you have most of the Arab countries now opening up to Israel, the question is why the state of Israel needs such sophisticated, more than 90, let's say, nuclear warheads, and why there is no accountability, for instance. And this kind of double standard of approaching this question actually invites negative emotions within the Iranian streets that say, and they create a kind of mental resistance and say, why is primitive, basic, even research program is scrutinized heavily but on the other side, for decades, having such sophisticated, I gave you very small, let's say, surveys of it and statistics, has never been, let's say, scrutinized, inspected, even discussed in any research centers and so on. So in conclusion of it, we need to talk about a free zone of the weapons of mass destruction, or specifically here we talk about nuclear. We need to make sure that all the countries in the Middle Eastern atmosphere are equally subjected to accountability when it comes to that. So I let my colleagues to discuss that more, and then we can come back to this.
Actually, I was thinking to talk more about how the West is talking or looking at the Middle East, but I just, as the Israeli in the room, apparently, I have to answer to some of the things that Ali said before I go to what I want to say. I mean, there's one thing that Ali said that I totally agree with. A WMD free zone in the Middle East is a very important topic, but it's such an important topic that you have to deal with lots of care when you deal with this topic. And one of the things that are crucial to remember is that Israel is not party to the non-proliferation treaty. Israel is not party to any of the treaties that are dealing with WMDs, and therefore Israel is not bound by these treaties. So when Israel doesn't let inspectors in its territories, Israel doesn't breaking any law. Unlike Iran, that was party to the NPT, to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, when there were some violations. However, and if we're going back to how the West treat Iran, somehow something that India, Pakistan, and Israel are doing. Sorry, it's not exactly the same because Iran was in the NPT and these states were outside the NPT, but yet the world was not very much loud when it came to sanctions, meaning when it came to punishing the whole population. for decades, and where a deal was achieved between Iran and the superpowers. The superpowers did not took their part of the deal very seriously, and the US broke a working deal. And that is, again, not something that I think you could have seen between the superpowers and a state that is not within the Middle East, unless it was Israel, I guess. So my problem is, on one hand, the fact that Israel is being treated as in a very automatic way, as the one that doesn't uphold to agreements, when actually Israel didn't sign any agreement. And it's important to remember that. I mean, you can't look at Israel and at Iran at the same way here for two reasons. The one reason is that Israel is not party to an agreement and Iran is a party to an agreement. And the second thing is Israel is a nuclear armed state and Iran is not. Two reasons not to look at the states at the same way. Now, when I'm saying that the WMD free zone, weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East is very important and something that needs to be taken care of, it's because not just that we have weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East, but it's because you can see that there is usage of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. Sorry, I forgot to silence my phone. I'll do it now so it will stop distract me. Now, not just that there was the usage of WMDs in the Middle East, and there's still a threat of WMDs in the Middle East, there's also a threat of nuclear proliferation in the Middle East, and nuclear, sorry, I forgot half of my English because I'm with COVID, nuclear arm race, that was the word I was looking, in the Middle East. And the reason is that it's not just Iran and Israel we need to look. We need to look at how the Middle East is divided. We need to look at how states in the Middle East are looking at each other with the new Abraham Accords. What kind of arrangement, security arrangement are these states are looking for? Are these states looking for any nuclear assurances from Israel? Is the next state in the region to disarm is really Iran, or is it actually Saudi Arabia? Is Saudi Arabia de facto a nuclear armed state? We don't know, and we don't talk about it much. And why don't we talk about it much? It's because Saudi Arabia is not in the evil axis, the axis of evil, that's how you call it, like Iran, but actually are good friends with the United States and developing relations with Israel. So the thing is that when we're talking about a weapon of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East, and about the care that we need to talk about, is that we have to stop, especially those who care, to talk in black and white, Iran versus Israel. Where is the Arab world in this? I mean, when we're looking at the Middle East, it's very, very comfortable for us to look in black and white and not to go into a deeper level of not who's to blame, who's the good. Nobody is good if they're trying to develop nuclear weapons. And the most important thing is that when we're looking at a WMD free zone in the Middle East, we can't look at disarming Israel from nuclear weapons without looking at the other nuclear armed states. And we're talking about 8 other nuclear armed states. And we're talking about 5 states that host American weapons on the ground in Europe as part of NATO sharing. Sharing is caring. So when we are looking at Western way of looking at this, there's several things that bother me. How much intention, how much energy the few that care about the zone are putting on the wrong places. So if you're looking at discussion after discussion after discussion at the UN, if you're looking at decisions made in an organization, or sorry, at meetings of all the states party to the non-proliferation treaty that are aiming at one state that is not there, meaning that these decisions have no point, have no power, and yet there are arguments about them, it means that most of the energy that comes from those who wants to do well goes on the wrong path. It goes where it can't work. In the Middle East Treaty Organization, one of the things that we paid attention to was the amount of panels of Europeans talking about the Middle East in this black and white manner, thinking that they can first solve the Middle East and then their own state, without even having Middle Easterns. Now, if the Middle East was very solvable and if we had nothing to worry about, then go ahead, play with the Middle East. But if on one hand, we're looking at the Middle East as the place where nuclear arm race might start, then we have to start talk with the Middle East. And when we have to talk in a way that finds solutions. So one of the things that we discovered when we started to look at what were the obstacles for any solution to the zone, to the Middle East, one of the things that we saw was exactly the way that the West is looking at the Middle East, not just using us for oil, for money, for weapon sales, and so on, but also using us in order to have no progress when it comes to nuclear disarmament, for example. So the nuclear armed states, for example, can have a month's discussions that at the end of it, they have to have some kind of a final document, like at the non-proliferation treaty, and then at the end to blame the Middle East for no progress when the one state that had no progress was not even in the room. So they can divert their own obligations to disarm to the one state that is not in the room, and by that have no progress on nuclear disarmament around the world because they're focusing on Israel. Now, I'm not saying that Israel should not disarm. I'm saying that if we're looking at the world and we're looking at the threats and we're looking at the care that needs to be, we need to start looking not in black and white, but what might work. And if we're putting our energy at blaming, at what's not working and what should we work according to justice, but not what is possible, we are doing something wrong. I'll stop here and I'll pass it to Emad.
Well, first of all, thank you everybody for joining us, and it's great to have this hybrid event. It's really great, and thanks to all the students within the Middle East Treaty Organization University Network and SOAS and everyone for making this happen. All right, we're going to jump in, and we're going to jump in. They're only giving me 9 minutes to do this, so I know that we're going to go real with proper timing. Sharon and Ali have painted a picture about what is happening in the region of the Middle East. Quickly, when we're talking about a WMD free zone in the Middle East, what does that mean? It means 22 Arab countries plus Iran and Israel. That's 24 countries. Get rid of or promise not to build, use and stockpile weapons of mass destruction in that geographical area. That's chemical weapons, biological weapons, and nuclear weapons. As has been said, in the region itself, right now, we have only one country with nuclear weapons, and that's Israel. However, there is advanced nuclear programs of Iran, and there's increasingly worries about Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and others also coming onto this bandwagon of pursuing or advancing their nuclear programs that may at some point be turned into a weaponization program. So when we're talking about nuclear programs, make sure, especially when you're reading the news, there's a distinction between a civilian nuclear program and a nuclear weapons program. Now, Iran has been labeled as wanting to have a nuclear weapons program. And yes, there's been some cases of non-compliance with its agreement, as been pointed out, under its signature as the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But these negotiations that Ali talked about in 2015 that led to the Iranian nuclear deal was a magnificent piece of document that not only showed that multilateralism works, diplomacy works, and the fact that if we are able to then deliver on the commitments of the world powers to Iran and Iran, to the rest of the international community, by what? Iran makes sure its nuclear program has inspections, monitoring, verification from A to Z. And that's what Ali was saying, from 24-hour cameras that send in all the data back to Vienna at the headquarters of the International Atomic Energy Agency, but also inspectors on the ground at Iranian nuclear facilities to make sure no fissile material, there's no diversion of Iran's nuclear program towards weaponization. In return, those sanctions that were placed on Iran were supposed to be removed. In return, Iran's nuclear program was supposed to become normalized. In return, the world powers would then commit to make sure that Iran can come out of this period of isolation and severe comprehensive sanctions that it's been facing. Let me make one thing clear here. Iran today is the most sanctioned country in modern history. It is more sanctioned than Nazi Germany was in the 40s. It is more sanctioned than North Korea is today. So keep that in mind when 80 million people are under sanctions, and it's a country that does not yet, we know, possess nuclear weapons. But it comes under this scrutiny and sanctions, sabotage, assassinations, and the list goes on. I want to point out this because it comes to the subject of our talk today, the Western perspectives on how they look at disarmament in the region. When it comes to Iran, we want to look at this perspective through three lenses: power, hypocrisy, and double standards. And this is where we've been talking about it, and it's been aired already, that every world power, specifically the United States, the Russians, the French, even, can you believe it, the Germans, and not to forget where you are, the United Kingdom, that they have all played a part in nuclearizing the region, the Middle East, and turning a blind eye when it suits them to make sure that their allies in the region pursue these weapons of mass destruction. May that be when Germany supported and provided chemical weapons, isotopes, and agents to Saddam Hussein so that he can use those agents to develop its chemical weapons program and drop it on its own people, the Kurds, and also during the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s. It is the same United States and France that built in the monoreactor in the Negev, deep down. The French built a reprocessing center that allowed Israel's nuclear program to pursue a plutonium track to nuclear weapons. The list goes on. And ironically, Iran's nuclear program began by the Atoms for Peace program of the United States. So even the genesis of Iran's nuclear program has the hands of Western powers in it. Therefore, when you see this level of tension, sanctions, and other coercive policies towards Iran just below war, you have a clear example of hypocrisy, double standards, and power. Now, I want to switch it around quickly and say, as Sharon said, there are 9 nuclear weapon states. Okay, 5 of them are what they're known as nuclear weapon states that are signatories to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, that treaty was supposed to be also a bargain, that those nuclear weapon states dismantle and get rid of their nuclear weapons with the promise that the rest of the world doesn't develop theirs. Where are we today? Where are we today? United States and Russia, with this little skirmish that is happening over Ukraine, are the 2 largest nuclear weapons stockpiles and that they have in the world. Almost above 90% of the world's nuclear weapons stockpile are in the hands of the Russians and United States. And third comes China, then France, and then guess who? United Kingdom. So when we are talking about nuclear weapons, when we're talking about disarmament, we have to keep in mind that the vast majority is still in the hands of the world powers. They have to deliver on their commitments. And if they come to the Middle East and say, why don't you just talk to each other? Why don't you just sit around a table and get rid of these weapons? Oh, excuse you. What about you? You are now spending hundreds of billions of dollars, pounds, to upgrade, modernize your nuclear warheads. And you know what? these world powers have kept the rest of us and the future existence of our species and other sentient beings hostage to these ridiculous weapons of mass destruction. That is why it's important that we realize that when these world powers play this game with the region and the rest of the world, in terms of their false promises of disarmament, that we hold them accountable. And that's where you come in. Because, like it or not, you at least have some democracy, or they're chipping at it, don't worry, they're chipping at it. But you still have some rights. You still have your voice. You still have your passion and power, because let me leave you with this. World powers, when we're talking about them, we're talking about governments. When we're talking about governments, we're talking about leaders of these governments. Some of them are elected, some of them are selected, doesn't matter. But where did they get their power? They didn't get it out of thin air. They got it. They extracted it. They've extracted it through colonialism, they've extracted it through exploitation, they've extracted it through inequality and injustice, and the list goes on. But they took it from you, and therefore you have the power to take it back. And in the Q&A, we'll discuss some of the ways you can do that. And as you can see already, members of the university network are at it to educate, advocate, and get the message out that, oh boy, get your government, the Brits, to get rid of those nukes. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. Thank you all of you for about this discussion and having this discussion right now, because it's very important. I think also SOAS, like the students, are very sensitive about the issues of colonialism and imperialism and what, like the influence that the West powers had and still have in the Arab world today. So if any of you ask questions for Emad, Sharon, and Ali right now, you can raise your hands and we start the discussion. Okay.
Hello. Firstly, thank you for your insights. And my question will be, what will be the main motivation of Israel to sign this deal when they already have the upper hand and, generally speaking, the force of the Western powers behind them? Like, why would they will decide on signing this when they right now don't actually need to, pragmatically? Could you hear it, or?
Yeah, thank you. But I was wondering, are we collecting questions or answering one by one?
I think one by one would be pretty good.
Okay. So it depends what is it that you're asking Israel to sign, of course. If you just ask Israel to give up its nuclear weapons, I guess the answer will be not even an answer. I mean, the question wouldn't be even heard. But if you're looking at any nuclear armed state, any state that possesses nuclear weapons, why do they have nuclear weapons? What is allowing it to continue? Why are they allowing themselves to continue putting so much money on something they can't use? I mean, you have to look at nuclear weapons, not just, I mean, if you just look at Israel nuclear weapons, you won't get an answer. Not just that, but what will get nuclear armed state to get rid of the nuclear weapons? So of course, some pressure would help, but it's not enough. What needs to be shown or discussed in any state that possess nuclear weapons is, first of all, that nuclear weapons are the end of mankind, and people forget to talk about it. So if we're looking at these weapons themselves, these are weapons that you can't use. And this is something that is not being discussed enough, not inside the nuclear armed states, and definitely not in Israel, when we hardly have this kind of a discussion. So Israel possesses nuclear weapons. We can't use the nuclear weapons. This is one reason why, at the end, eventually, Israel will have to sign something. The second thing, the second reason was, if we can't stop a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, then we have to do something. Now, what is it, this something that Israel can do? Now, If you look at other nuclear attempts in the Middle East, you can see Libya, you can see Syria, and you can see Iraq. In Iraq and in Syria, Israel bombed. Iran, we can't bomb. But even if you leave Iran, there are rumors on a deal between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. If Saudi Arabia will feel that they need to have nuclear weapons, they can buy them from Pakistan. Saudi Arabia just finished a nuclear facility on their property. Jordan is starting to build one. There are nuclear facilities in Egypt. There are going to be nuclear facilities in the Emirates. All these states are states that Israel simply can't bomb, either because it's too complicated, like in Iran, or that they're good friends with the US. Israel can't bomb. So what is it that Israel can do in order to prevent nuclear arms race in the Middle East? Israel will have to think about something new than just not talking about it. So if you're looking at these kind of threats and at the fact that Israel cannot use nuclear weapons without causing all mankind to suffer, so including Israelis, and if you look at the fact that Israel is a tiny, tiny, tiny state, meaning 1 or 2 nuclear bombs are the end of Israeli infrastructure, you understand that Israel cannot live with a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Therefore, once the discussion will be responsible enough, Israel will have to be part of the discussion. I mean, the ability or my anger with the way the discussion is going now, it's because it allows Israel not to take part. And the problem is not just the West cuddling Israel. The problem is also Iran and the Arab states talking, or for years talking in the same language, that have changed in the last 2-3 years towards this conference that now happens once a year at the UN to work on a document that they can all agree at the end to sign on, with everything that will make the states in the region feel secure to sign on something like that. That was a long answer. I hope.
Any other questions?
There are questions in the chat.
Oh, okay, amazing. So if I'm going to quickly, I have a question in the meantime before I get some of the questions up virtually. I am quite interested. We speak a lot about diplomatic practice, about collective action, especially within track 1 and 2 diplomacy. But I'm interested to know why we still expect MENA region states and their civilians to kind of hold faith and support diplomatic kind of efforts at disarmament and peace building within the region when they could, as opposed, for example, to radical action. They've been deeply impacted by colonial efforts and projects over the last 100 years and longer, by foreign intervention and by sanctions, like Emad mentioned. So is it not problematic to expect states from the region and their people to assume that they have the only way forwards is to stay within diplomacy? That's, I think, my question, and how you would give them an incentive. Definitely.
If you don't mind, I'll just take this quickly. The region and its people are not just putting all of their eggs in the basket of diplomacy and waiting for the world powers to give them some, freedoms and so forth. The region and its people have been fighting for their independence and for their own sovereignty for decades, for the centuries. That's why colonialism ultimately ended in the region. Second World War had a part in it, but the movements that erupted. Iran, for example, had its revolution in '79, but there are 3 issues here. One is that taking the road of nonviolence, taking the road of multilateralism, diplomacy, discussion, conversation, these are all pathways that are, of course, going to be more peaceful. Whereas there is this other side, which calls for radical change, may that be through revolution, evolution, direct action. Unfortunately, extremes come into play here. So there is a whole mosaic and ways to go about achieving peace, stability, and disarmament in the region. We advocate for a nonviolent approach, but there is other ways that it's been done. We are seeing right now the sabotages that are going on in nuclear facilities. We're looking at the assassinations that are going on. The hypocrisy, the double standards, the fact that we've already discussed that, if I can even throw you some numbers here, that the largest exporters of weapons in the world are the United States, Russia, and then is China. And of course, don't worry, the UK is also there at the top 6. But if you look at who they sell these weapons to, the United States, 50% of its sales goes to the Middle East. The Russians, also in the high numbers, goes to the Middle East. The United Kingdom, half of its weapon sales goes to Saudi Arabia and Oman. Saudi Arabia, let me give you real direct numbers. I'll get back to you on this one, but it's basically like how 32% of UK arms exports goes to Saudi Arabia, 17 to Oman. That already hits very close to half of British exports. So this saying that, you have the fact that it's flooded by means of war, is the fact that there is this political backing for dictators, for autocratic regimes, that these allies of the West remain in their thrones, in their palaces. But in reality, you know, it's like a facade that ultimately what we saw in the Arab Spring or in all of these movements that are continuing, that there is no way to stop the push and the drive of the people of the region to achieve what many others take for granted, and that's peace, stability, and some security of the future. And that includes human security and not just the state's security.
Thank you. I think Sharon has raised her hand. I'm not sure if that's on purpose. Yeah, amazing. Yeah, Sharon, take it away.
You asked why would the people in the Middle East believe in agreements, in diplomacy? And I think that the first thing I wanted to jump and say, because what is the option? When you look at agreements, you understand that agreements are always just as strong as the goodwill of the people participating in them. That's it. So you can have decades of lack of goodwill, but once goodwill is there, then suddenly diplomacy is an amazing way forward. And actually, you see something now that you haven't seen for a long time. Emad was the one that at the November conference. The November conference is a yearly conference to achieve a binding, freely arrived at text that will solve the zone when it comes to weapons of mass destruction and maybe the means of delivery. And in this room, there were the states of the Middle East in the middle, and only at the back seats, there were the representatives of the superpowers and the international organizations. But this is the room where the Middle East is trying to solve itself. And surprising and very, very, very hopeful is the fact that they have achieved what we call a final document. And the reason it's so important is because in order to reach a final document, they have to agree on it by consensus. So it's true that Israel is not in the room, but 22 Arab states and Iran agreeing on something is not a walk in the park. To think that the Arabs can all agree on something is like thinking that Europe can all agree on something. And actually, there's much more chance for all Europeans to agree on something than in the Middle East. I mean, we are fractured. And as Emad said, there are people that have no belief in diplomacy. And the percentage of people that do not believe in diplomacy in the Middle East, I'm not sure if by percentage it's bigger than those in the United States. But we do know how it looks like when it comes with violence and when it comes with actions by states that are not democratic. But when it comes to believing or not believing in international diplomacy, states are still, since 1967 and then 1970, members of a non-proliferation treaty. The whole world almost agreed to give up on nuclear weapons in 1970, and it's almost capped, because instead of 5 nuclear armed states, we only have now 9 nuclear armed states, and not more than that. I mean, most states gave up on something, and as far as we don't like the NPT, it just shows that diplomacy does work to an extent, and it probably the reason we're still living on this planet.
I would like to answer also very
Sure.
quickly. When we say diplomacy, we need to understand, we need to come out of our shells. We need to see things from outside the circle in a neutral way. When we say diplomacy, who sets the agenda in those negotiations and diplomacy? That is very important. Is there any equality around the negotiation table? Do we have a hierarchy who sets the agenda? JCPOA actually proved that who sets the agenda. In this concept, when President Trump unilaterally withdrew, there was a kind of a showing that diplomacy that we hoped for, the power that sets the agenda can actually turn it away completely. So we talk about diplomacy like a chocolate box, and then we say, is happening? Yes, it's happening in the Middle East. You can see Iran proved that is willing to be part of it. So one state facing the whole world and signing it. Signature of JCPOA was a signature of all the global community. But one country, one president went, walk away, and then literally killed the JCPOA at that point. And that shows who sets the agenda. We need to have equality, global community to come to set the agenda for weapons of mass destruction, not only 1 or 2 or 3 states. And also the last point I would say, yes, it's black and white when it comes to nuclear, because we cannot simply constantly saying, oh, it's complicated. It's not complicated. The whole world must be taken to accountability. Any power that has nuclear arsenal should be treated equally by the global community. The agenda should be set by the global community, and any country, no matter it has got 90 nuclear warhead or 1 or 2,000, should be disarmed. That is a solution. Otherwise, we're just sitting and around say, oh, diplomacy, United Arab Emirates wants to have it, Saudi Arabia wants to have it, Turkey wants to have it, and Israel has got 90, and that's okay because it's not part of NPT. This is like, as I say, I'm not signing a human rights declaration, so I can do whatever I want. It's not about that. Also, the state of Israel must be accountable and come to the NPT. The global community needs to take everybody equally into responsible, and the agenda should be set by the United Nations from Uganda all the way to Switzerland, to China, to US. Not only few countries sitting here and then keep saying about diplomacy. Diplomacy is happening. People in the Middle East always proved that they are interested in diplomacy when it comes to all the negotiations. But the last point Emad said, we need to learn a lesson from the Western silence when Saddam's criminal activity against the Kurdish people and the Halabja massacre at that time faced no resistance or obligations or objections unless happened. And then the world was surprised. So I think the world should have one entity, act as one entity to set the agenda, not 1 or 2 states to set the agenda, and constantly projecting bureaucratic elements within the media.
I noticed both Emad and Sharon put their hands up, so I think I'll let you both give a quick response and then we can move on to the next question from the audience.
Thank you. So first, to make clear, and I think this is just maybe not a very good example of the black and white discourse. To say that Israel is not party to the NPT is the truth. It doesn't mean that Israel should have nuclear weapons. It just means that when you talk about Israel, you should be very, very direct at what you're saying, or right about what you're saying. Israel doesn't have to have IAEA inspectors on its ground because it never committed to it. Doesn't mean that We don't think that Israel should have nuclear weapons. I mean, please don't try to make it seem like I think that Israel should have nuclear weapons, or else I wouldn't work for 20 years on disarming Israel and the other states from nuclear weapons. So this is just a bad example on this kind of discourse. Israel is not party to any of the treaties, which means Israel is not party to a discourse that Israel should be part of. But when Israel is not committed to a treaty and did not sign the treaty, it means that if you say that Israel is violating, then you're wrong. And better be right when you're talking about nuclear weapons, because it's important to be right when you're talking about nuclear weapons. And this is my problem with the discourse, which is not my problem with Ali. This is my problem with the way that the media is putting it, with the way that mainly other activists are looking at it. Because if we're all working on disarming nuclear armed states from their nuclear weapons, which is something that every sane person should do, then we should do it the right way and not waste time, energy, and slogans on the wrong things. When we did, for example, the campaign in Israel of Don't Bomb Talk, and that was a call for diplomacy and not for war, that campaign worked because we talked about very specifically about a political and diplomatic solution to the fear that Israelis had from being bombed by an Iranian bomb, even though Iran didn't have a bomb. It didn't matter what the truth was. It did matter how people talked about it. And that's why it's so important for me that when we're talking now, that we will say things as they are and try to find solutions, and not these accusations that are so easy to say and make us feel right, and yet will get us nowhere. There are 9 nuclear armed states. 5 of them are the superpowers, are those who have a permanent seat at the UN Security Council. This is a price that they get, kind of, for having nuclear weapons. Then we have states outside the non-proliferation treaty, meaning states that got their nuclear weapons after 1967, did their first testing after 1967, 4 more states that possess nuclear weapons, 9 states. It doesn't matter when they'll bomb one, whether they are from within or from outside the NPT at the end. So at the end, it is our responsibility to find solutions to how to disarm them all. And when we're doing it, it's also important that we need to get them, these states, on board. I mean, without getting the nuclear states on board, we will achieve nothing. And I think that, again, this is something that is important to remember. When we're talking about Israel, it's the same as if we're talking about India, or the same as if we're talking about the United States. They all possess nuclear weapons. They all have to find a way to feel secure without it.
Emad, did you have anything to add on?
You know, I always have something to add on, but but I was going to say, actually, let me leave it at that, and let's move on to the next question. I'm sure I'll be able to sneak it in somehow.
Okay, amazing. So in the audience, we've got Poppy asking whether, is it more important to prevent Western powers selling and allowing nuclear proliferation in the Middle East, or is it more important to make sure that Middle Eastern countries have their own internal reasons to disarm and encourage a deal amongst the region? I'll leave it open to whoever wants to answer that.
As a good Iranian, I would say a little bit of both. Why choose it as one or the other? It's important because what we're actually discussing also today is the fact that there needs to be a regional solution that comes from within the Middle East, that we know our region better than the outsiders who are telling us what our region should do or should say or should think. So yes, there is an organic push within to find solutions, and these negotiations that Sharon mentioned in New York, that is known as the November conference, they basically exemplify when these 22 Arab countries plus Iran and the world powers meet with the world powers on the periphery and the region in the center. They are the ones negotiating. They will ultimately have to sign on. They have to put their signatures there. So yes, there needs to be a collective effort within the region to identify all of this abundance of reasons why they shouldn't have WMDs, especially in a volatile region that they are witness to. They are seeing failed states, semi-failed states, civil wars, carnage, sectarianism, terrorism, the list goes on. The region is well versed in things going wrong. So there is enough reason to say to its leaders, do you really think nuclear deterrence or WMDs is going to save you? And we have to strip this idea that nuclear weapons provide security, that provide deterrence, that provide some sense of, prestige. We need to strip it of all of that. And that is where, for example, what we have seen now, global involvement is the new nuclear ban treaty, or the TPNW, which then makes nuclear weapons illegal. Is a legal document under international law making nuclear weapons illegal. We have another instrument, another tool in our backpack to use to basically delegitimize nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. That's from within the region. But as Sharon and others said, ultimately, also the world powers have to disarm. All those 9 nuclear weapon states have to find a way and good reasons within their own populations, within their own societies. That comes back to you guys again. Why are the British with nuclear weapons? I mean, think about it. I mean, you're a little island state somewhere in top of Europe. You don't even want to be part of the EU. Do you think your nukes are, what are you doing with nukes? Just think about that for a second. So what's the purpose of it? So we need to also educate our own populations, our own lawyers, lawmakers, policymakers, and governments of the fallacy of thinking that nuclear weapons will provide you some prestige or some honor. So that being said, it's also important that within these countries that are flooding the Middle East with weapons, we've discussed that, with this wrong policies of just keeping these dictators and autocratic regimes in power through their alliances, and just because of greed, profits, and to make sure that some of the corporations or governments get the funds and the resources from the region, but let the region bleed for it. So we need to also, within our own communities, really highlight those things, that the peace in United Kingdom, the peace in Europe should not be at the expense of the wars and blood and treasure of the Middle East. That ultimately, in this connected world, what instability we face in the Middle East, the shores to Europe are not far. We just have to pop over. So keep that in mind when we're thinking about what it means when Western powers continue to cause instability in the Middle East, thinking that that instability remains in the Middle East. It doesn't. So vice versa, if the European powers, world powers, see the value in promoting human development, security, economic development, or other means of doing better in the region, and really be supporters of democracy and choice, then we will see that within the region, we have the capability, we have the demographics, we have all the tools to be able to flourish and become, once again, an example to the rest of the world that we can actually achieve some level of peace, prosperity, and wisdom and knowledge that we brought back in the day to your shores during your dark ages.
Dr. Alavi, did you have anything to add there? I think you wanted to.
Emad very enthusiastically responded to this, so I have nothing. I enjoyed that. Yes, I agree. As I mentioned, the hierarchy needs to be reevaluated, and I agree with Emad. Syrian refugee crisis showed that what happens in some part of the world is not going to be isolated in that specific part of the world. Syrian refugee crisis actually affected Europe, and you have also, unfortunately, Syrian refugees even in Latin America and the rest of the world. So it does show that we are totally connected. But when it comes to disarmament, we need to have a practical solution and rather than rhetoric. And that is to bring United Nations, empowering United Nations to lead the agenda, and not only the 5 powers, but also every country according to the list of what kind of weapons, specifically when it comes to weapons of mass destruction and nuclear, who possess what, and to be equally taking into accountability. If it is not part of NTP or whatever, is not an excuse, needs to be part of it. And then to be taken accountable. I'm not part of this, so I'm not going to do anything, is not a solution. As I said, agenda must be set by United Nations and every member of the United Nations. And of course, every country should be accountable equally and to support each other equally as well to achieve that peace.
Thank you so much. Does anyone from the audience have a question? Yeah, sure. I'm just going to bring, so there's 2 of you, so I'm going to bring it to the first row first, and then I'm going to hand over to the next person. Oh, yeah.
Hi, hello everyone, and thank you very much. I'm so sorry, I have a flight on 7 p.m., so I probably need asking first. Thank you very much. My question is for the weapon, which let me rethink about the nuclear project of the Iran. As a Chinese, I have a question. In the future, for Chinese government, what can we do trying to negotiate with both sides, one side with Iran, the other side with the European Union and America? What Chinese government can play the role? How could we do trying to let all of us have more peaceful negotiation rather than more conflict? Thank you.
Emad, do you want to answer that?
Thank you very much.
Or maybe you want. Okay, when it comes to Iran and China, China played a significant role in JCPOA. So if you look at the composition of JCPOA, is China, Russia, United States, United Kingdom, France, and European Union. So literally here you have quite a different position when it comes to China, less vocal, less provocative, and stayed within the JCPOA. So I would say is quite a balancing element when you see it, when the agenda is set by one side and they can withdraw, but you have also other side, which is the East, disregard China. Although China has been quite quiet when it comes to announcements and declarations, but I think can play a significant role in creating that balance, equilibrium within the diplomacy, and also it has a less, let's say, or at least provocative role in that element. JCPOA, in conclusion, I would say it could have been a significant role model for future problem solving. For instance, that could, if it was successful, which it was, 2015 when President Obama signed it, but later on, again, we have a weakness here that the global community could not actually offset or, let's say, mitigate the absence of President Trump in that regard. So this is not only about Iran. JCPOA can be a first step towards future problem solving through diplomacy and through taking every single country equally accountable for their activities. But China is playing a significant role in this.
Thank you very much. I'm running to airport.
And I will join you.
Safe trip, safe trip.
Thank you. Have a safe flight. I'm just going to hand over to you now.
Hi, I'd just like to preface by thanking the speakers for the valuable insight and excellent points made, especially on the hypocrisy of the West and their treatment towards the MENA region and the disarmament. I'd just like to quickly highlight something Sharon said about Saudi Arabia's involvement within this. I think it's really important to highlight the difference in region volatility between the two when talking about how we view Iran and Saudi Arabia in terms of Israel. Iran and Israel are in a region of significantly higher volatility, especially given the history of the geography around that area. So I think my question going forward is is how do we prioritize the diffusion of this volatility? And then going onwards, how do we go about solving this tension between all these countries and getting them to sit together in a way that we're not comparing who's the evil power, and especially in regards to America's involvement offshore? Thank you.
Sharon, if you have a response, and then you can also for the raised hand.
Yeah, thanks. So the raised hand was, I think, and I give myself a good excuse for being sick now. I think maybe I am totally misunderstood here. From what Ali said, it seems like I think that we shouldn't do anything because Israel is not party of the NPT, and that there should be a hierarchy of who's disarmed first. There is no doubt, Ali, that the fact that Israel is not party to the NPT doesn't mean that Israel shouldn't disarm. Let's be clear. We totally agree on that, which is why in 2007 I decided to start a campaign on that in Israel. In 2014, I decided that it's time to take the campaign regionally and wrote a suggestion on how to disarm the Middle East from weapons of mass destruction. So we're in total agreement on that. However, I think that when the West is looking at one nuclear armed states in the Middle East in a different way that they're looking at the rest of the nuclear armed states, then we have a problem. And it's the same problem exactly the same problem with how the West is looking at a state that doesn't comply with the NPT, like Iran, and doesn't look at all at another state that is not in that doesn't comply to the NPT, like the United States that hosts its own weapons on 5 nuclear armed race with nuclear states now because they're hosting American weapons as part of NATO sharing. So if it seems like I think that nuclear armed states shouldn't disarm as soon as possible, I needed to make this correct. When it comes to China actually, from all the nuclear powers, is actually one of the more responsible one when it comes to how many weapons they can build and how many weapons they did build. What China can do in order to help the Middle East is, first, when it comes to foot on the ground and financial foot on the ground, we prefer superpowers to do less, not more. But when it comes to this topic of WMD free zone, we have to say that the Chinese government was very supportive of the discussions in the room, and also even supportive of the Middle East Treaty Organization, which was quite surprising and nice. And the last thing is, when we're looking at the nuclear arms race, it's time to do a campaign that pushes them all there. It's not enough to disarm the Middle East if we're not using it as a push for the other states. And yes, we need to look at Saudi Arabia and not at Iran if we're looking at the second nuclear arms race. I mean, the second one that can become nuclear in the Middle East is Saudi Arabia, but we're not talking about it. We're talking about Iran. We're talking about Iran because it's much easier, black and white. And that's the black and white that I'm talking about. Much easier to talk about Iran because it's not complicated. With Saudi Arabia, it's very complicated. You're selling weapons to them. You are using Saudi ground. You are buying oil from them. So let's not talk about Saudi Arabia. Let's talk about Iran. It's much easier. And that's dangerous.
Thank you. I think Alice had a question next, so I'm just going to come and bring the mic over, and then you can go ahead.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yeah, so I have a question about you all. The three of you talked about the power that the Western countries have in the UN as well, as deciding about nuclear weapons and how they are used, how they are proliferated, etc. So when we talk about the UN, there's also like this idea of the UN as the mean, the best mean for peace and for like achieve the aims of diplomacy. And I wanted to know what you think about the relation and the influence that the Western powers or like the countries that own nuclear weapons have on the UN, and how this influence then its relation to the issue. Thank you.
Well, you said West, but look into the whole world. The 3 Western states that do possess nuclear arsenal are part of the Security Council, which they have a veto rights. And that makes things quite complicated when it comes to any accountability. So I think United Nations as such, there is a hierarchy, and that actually creates a kind of obstacle when it comes to this element. On one point, I agree with Sharon that yes, there should be, I don't need to mention the name of the country, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and then Kuwait comes and Armenia, Azerbaijan. I would say every single country should be accountable, regardless, is it a friendly regime or access of something, or is this or that? You should be accountable equally within a kind of equal representation and a system such as United Nations that can actually look into it. But again, it comes back to the Security Council. To what extent the 5 powers within the Security Council, which 5 of them actually possess the nuclear weapons, would be willing to compromise on their veto rights and veto power. This is a question needs to be sorted.
Thank you so much. Emad, I don't know if Emad or Sharon wanted to answer as well.
Yes, I'll quickly come in. I'll go in reverse order. Alice, great question. When it comes to United Nations, and we already know now the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, the easy, quick answer is that the UN also requires reform. The UN that was established at the end of the Second World War was set up in a way that gives the central, most important organ of the UN, be the UN Security Council, that is the only part of the UN that can actually use force in terms of sanctions or permit war on another country, because its purpose is to maintain international peace and security. Now, those 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, they haven't changed since 1945. And so that in itself requires a change. The hierarchy that we talked about, the power that we talked about, the UN has to go through reform. And what's stopping it is because these world powers are holding on to their veto power. But their voices within the UN are growing louder and louder from emerging powers such as Brazil, India, places like Japan, Germany, even Iran and Nigeria, South Africa. They're saying, excuse me, we don't live in that world anymore. Why do you have veto power? So there's already a boiling things happening within the UN that is asking for more equality within the UN. That's why once that evolution happens, once that change happens within the UN, we will see how it then will impact how the agenda is set, which topics actually make it to the UN Security Council that are the real important causes or impacts of insecurity that we are facing on a planetary level. So when it comes to UN, which UN are we talking about? The UN Security Council, corrupt. We need that changed. The UN General Assembly doesn't have as much power, but it has representation from all of the 195, 196 countries. So there's still room inside the UN for these power dynamics to shift. And it is happening. There's one thing that we cannot avoid, and that's change. Change will come. What form that change takes depends on us, on the vision we have, on the mission we have, on what we can see the possibilities of the future. That is why the Middle East Treaty Organization, when we talk about the vision we have for the Middle East, it may seem unrealistic at this moment, but I'm telling you, it's not. The same way that at the end of the Second World War, can you imagine? I know you Brits came out of the European Union, but until recently, that's your mistake. That's your own business. But But the European Union, the idea of the European Union, do you know how old that is? Late 1940s, early 1950s. A couple of characters came together and said, are we going to continue butchering each other because we didn't learn from World War I? We had World War II, and on top of it, we had a little cherry on top and dropped some nukes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Is this the way we're going to solve our problems? 80 million dead. And by the way, many uncounted dead that came from the Middle East and North Africa. And so when we are looking at what the European Union as its genesis looked like, was in the aftermath of carnage. So when people say, is there a possibility for the Middle East to be peaceful? Can actually the Saudis and the Iranians and the Israelis and the Palestinians get along? Of course we can. We are. We just need to reach a critical stage and be left alone in terms of what? Stop flooding our region with the means of war. Stop supporting dictators. Stop playing lip service to democracy and human rights and then turn your other face and then fund and protect the human rights violations that are happening because they're your friends. Okay, so we got to keep these things in this sort of like knowledge, open our eyes, have a paradigm shift, understand the politics, the dynamics, the geopolitics, the political risk, the involvement of global powers within the region, historical, contemporary, today, and in the future. But you know what's happening? US is disengaging from the region. They're worried more about China now. Talk about China. They're worried about China. The Saudis and the rest have realized that the Americans will fight to the last Arab, Iranian, Turk, Afghani, but not to the last American. So you can't buy that security with all of that you're dropping on the treasury in buying the American weapons and putting your their military bases on your territories. It cannot ultimately buy security. So this is where the conversation has started. When the Americans packed their bags in Afghanistan after 20 years, the most impoverished country, and they left that country in another bigger mess. But Afghanistan defeated the United States. So what is going to be left for our region is to decide, are we going to continue betting our security, prosperity, and future in the hands of world powers or on our own? The conversation has started. Saudi Arabia and Iran now are in the 5th round of discussions that started in Baghdad, mediated by Iraq, between Iran and Saudi Arabia. You have, for what is worth, good or bad, the Abraham Accords, where Israel has now engaged with some Arab countries. You have a new sense of belief in the region that the future requires a regional effort, that we have much more in common than, can you believe, the Italians, the French, Germans, and the Brits when they were together trying to formulate and form the European Union. We are just a bunch of Arabs, Kurds, a couple of other characters, Israelis, Jews, Iranians. And we can actually handle this if we actually come together, because what makes us, the common ground amongst us, is by far greater than what divides us. We just have to have a clear eye that the divide and conquer policy of the United Kingdom during its colonial times and the French no longer can work in our region. So it has to reach that level. With that being said, just quickly on China, they have 3 advantages. Number 1, they don't have a colonial past in the region. Number 2, they have relations with everybody. And number 3, they don't ask questions. It's economy. We don't talk politics. We don't talk human rights. You just let us sell our stuff to you and you sell your stuff to us. That in itself allows for some level of comfort in engaging with everybody in the region. Iranians, Saudis, Israelis, why not? So the Chinese actually have quite an interesting role, because everybody else in the room from world powers has had a finger in the region, may that be through colonialism, invasion, occupation, or genocide. So there's a lot that they have, the baggages. The Chinese bring less, not zero. Thank you.
Zemal, did you have a question?
Okay, thank you so much for your points. I think a phrase that comes to my mind is Fukuyama's adage that the post-Cold War world instituted the end of history, and now we're sort of living in the hegemony of the United States and global capitalism. I suppose now that adage has been disproven by quite a large metric, and you have these hot zones in the world opening up, like in Ukraine and in Taiwan and in many other regions. So as the United States sort of loses its political capital, as it did with Afghanistan, and we move towards a more multipolar world as opposed to a unipolar world, do you think states like Russia, I know we've spoken about China extensively, but states like Russia, how they will respond to instituting a WMD free zone in the Middle East? Thank you.
Well, Russia also, as a part of the Security Council, having a veto rights, and sees itself privileged, inheriting what Soviet Union had, and the concept of Ukraine that we can see now. Expansion of NATO is a different discussion. I don't want to get to that now, but the fascinating discussion. Expansion of NATO, and NATO is supposed to be even dismantled at the end of the Cold War, but actually expanded in a very excessive way. So I don't see Russia would give up all these its nuclear arsenal while sees NATO's expansion next door. And as you can see, that element in Ukraine. So I agree with Emad in one point that United Nations needs a little bit of reform and assurances, and also accountability for every state, regardless their nature, when it comes even to be a friendly regime towards the United States or to be hostile or whatever. So that's a point. But I don't think Russia would. I can't imagine in the realistic world would voluntarily give up the nuclear arsenal.
Okay, amazing. I also have a question over social media from our co-director, Tony. He says that, I think we can agree that the NPT is obsolete. It hasn't achieved universalization, and in the current climate, this will never happen. Should non-nuclear weapon states withdraw from the NPT and sign up to the nuclear weapons free zones if they aren't already members, and for example, the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons? Is there any value in non-nuclear weapon states continuing to engage with nuclear weapon states?
Anyone?
Well, I think that I mean, all of us, we're in METO, most of us, we're activists. We don't like the NPT. We have lots of criticism on the NPT. However, the nuclear armed states, they are at the NPT, and that is the only place that they've gave any kind of obligation to disarm. Article 6 of the NPT talks about the disarmament of the nuclear armed states. And that's the only place where they gave this kind of obligation. So before we leave the NPT and leave it to them to make whatever decisions they have, we still need to hold it for a little bit longer, I think. So we have the arena where we can push them to put a timeline, because it's nice to have an obligation. It can't be that every time that they have to talk about a timeline, they find a reason not to talk to, for example, the Middle East, which is what happened in 2015. So the NPT is obsolete. The NPT is problematic. The NPT was signed in 1967 and came into force in 1970. In 1995, the NPT was the end of the NPT. At the beginning, it was only for 25 years. In 95, there was a decision that showed how much disrespect the West and the world has for the Arab states and Iran, because the Arab states and Iran said, we will vote for the extension of the NPT indefinitely if you promise us a nuclear weapon free zone in the Middle East. And the world said yes. Now, what's the problem with that is that the world said yes to something that they cannot deliver again, because Israel is not party of the NPT. So the world said yes to something, and it's not an excuse. I'm just saying that there was no legally binding instrument to come through with a promise that the whole world gave the Arab states and Iran. And yet they made this decision, and this is the reason why the NPT is still here. And this is, I think, one of the major examples of how the West is looking at the Middle East, because they're still dragging something that they cannot promise without saying, actually, what we need to do is to take this process outside of the NPT and make sure it happens. And I want to say one last thing from my side, I think. We talked about diplomacy and we talked about goodwill, but not enough. Because when we were looking at all the states talking about the WMD free zone in the Middle East, what we heard from everybody was that it was impossible. From the Westerns, from the Easterns, from the Middle East states, from Israel, from Iran, and from the Arab states. Everybody said it was impossible. And the only thing that we needed in order to come up with a solution or few solutions that all of them that said that it's not possible, suddenly they looked at this document that we produced and said, actually, this is possible. And then we produced another one that was another possibility. The only thing that we did in order to come up to a solution was to imagine for one moment that they actually want to find a solution. And the minute that we imagining them wanting to find a solution, we were able to produce a mechanism, something that will show them that it is possible. And that's all it needed. And that's why we are such a great believers in diplomacy in this case, and in the ability to talk to the states in a way that will make them want to have a conversation. And that's our responsibility.
That was brilliant, Sharon. Can I just add something quickly, because I think it's important. I know our dear Tony doesn't like the NPT. I know, Tony. We have a lot of problems with it. But we should use every tool we've got to hold those governments responsible and make sure that they deliver on their commitments. May that be the NPT. May that be within the UN Security Council. May that be within resolutions that are passed that are binding on all countries against trafficking of or supplying or providing WMDs to non-state actors or in the language of terrorism. So there is a lot of instruments we can use from like 1925 Geneva Protocol. Geneva, is that what it's called? Geneva, yeah, whatever it is. It's like basically created the first sort of discussions on chemical weapons use from 1925. So we will use everything, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Biological and Toxins Convention. We will use the new instrument that we have now, the Nuclear Ban Treaty, the NPT, the November Conference that is actually driven by the United Nations Secretariat. What do I mean by the Secretariat? That tall building in New York, and the Secretary General is in it. That's what they call it, the Secretariat. Now, the Secretary General is supposed to be the one that is actually pushing this November conference. It's sort of like, facilitator, provides the rooms, says nice things, and brings these people to have a conversation. In addition to that, one part of this tool set that we've got is what? Civil society. Hello, you, me, what we're doing, the Middle East Treaty Organization. Don't forget that. Because you know what? You know how we got to the TPNW, the Nuclear Ban Treaty? Not because governments were like, oh, we would love to make nuclear weapons illegal. No, my darlings, no. It's because civil society said, we're done with this. And then they got allied countries. You know what? We actually have some good countries out there. I know it's a miracle, but we do. I mean, New Zealand, they're nice, they're far, but they're good in these things. Ireland, can you believe it? They're so close to the British, but they're so different. We love them. We love the Irish. The Irish are the forefront of disarmament. And they've been always the supportive of METO from day one. We have these countries that you never heard of. I don't know, Finland, Sweden, these things, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, Mexico, Kazakhstan. I mean, these are countries that are actually our allies in the pursuit of having a world free from nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. Japan is at the forefront. So we have these governments that can help us. We have civil society that has to put the pressure on the governments to deliver on what they have promised. And this is key for us, because when we take all of these tracks, these parallel tracks from the UN, civil society, bilateral, multilateral, JCPOA, you name it, when we bring all of these tracks together, any progress on one is a progress on all in terms of disarmament. We need to use every single way we can, go through every door we can, make our voices heard in every forum we can, so that we keep this fire alive, that you cannot hold our future hostage. We need to be clear about that the world powers and their nuclear weapons are holding our future hostage. They have no right. We never gave them the right. We never gave them that power to be able to rule over every human being and our species and our planet by having the power over a red button that can destroy us. We need to take that away. And we can take it away peacefully. We will try our best. And there are many ways we can do that. If everything on that fails, we will have an offline conversation about other means, but it will not be discussed over Zoom.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Okay, there's another question.
Okay, I think this will be our last question for the discussion, and then we
Right.
can move on to the end. So I'll just grab the mic.
Hello. So my question is, as you were talking about how Western powers are seeing the Middle East as an enemy and a risk, and my question is, could it be because of the different perspective of the radicalization of Islam and Islamophobia in Europe, and maybe do you think that secularism in Iran and in other Middle Eastern countries can change the perspective of the Western population to be more peaceful against Middle East? Because, like, when I think, I'm from Turkey, so even us, the liberals, we understand the, for example, Palestinian perspective, and that they have the rights in their action. But even so, most of the people in the liberals' perspective will still prefer an Israeli culture in Middle East than an Arab one, because it's more nearer to ours, and that's a reality. And probably Western people are more on that line in the majority when I think about it. So, yeah.
I'll leave it to all of the speakers to take this one on, if they'd like.
Well, I'm just going to say Turkey is a special friend of ours. They don't know if they want to be part of Europe, they want to be part of Middle East. They've also been, the Ottoman Empire. Don't forget, the Ottoman Empire until the end of the First World War eclipsed over this region that then the world powers, the French, the British, and the rest carved up. So the Ottomans, and then Ataturk, and then the new modern state of Turkey, and secularism, and its identity crisis on trying to join the EU, but in the EU saying 80 million Muslims joining a Christian bloc. I don't think so. Keep knocking on that door, but we'll first give it to Bulgaria, we'll give it to Romania, we'll even give it to Armenia, but we won't give it to you. And so then the Turks is like, oh, we've been waiting for this thing to get into the EU. Maybe it's not working. So then Erdogan changes foreign policy. Like, you know what, let's focus on the Middle East. Let's go back to our good old days when we had an Ottoman Empire. So let's keep that in mind, that secularism doesn't automatically mean no expansion, no colonialism, no imposition, and so forth. And it also doesn't mean that the radicalization of Islam is maybe the right way to put it. The radicalization happens in every of its form, and is not unique to Islam or any other ideology. The fact that we have Islamophobia is the reason why Europe is going far right. The nationalistic approaches that we're seeing, the far right rising in the polls and in the governments across the region, is the fact that it is about fear is that if I can make you be fearful, I can strip you of all your rights. And by doing that, I have power over you. I'll tell you what to think, who your enemy is, and what you should do to make sure that I'm in power because I'm going to protect you. Okay? Now, keep that in mind, that when we are talking about this region and when we're talking about these countries on the periphery, because Turkey has a long history of being swinging between these two worlds, because in reality, Turkey is the real bridge between our region and Europe. Right now, maybe our friend doesn't want to know about this, but the European Union, to the tune of 5 billion euros every year, provides Turkey the means to block the Syrian refugees and others trying to pour into Europe. This is what they're doing in terms of refugees. Go back to the Second World War, watch the movie Casablanca, and you'll see the route the Europeans took to escape the war in Europe. Where did they go? On those same looking boats, cross that pond called the Mediterranean, through the Turkish borders to escape the carnage in Europe. And now the gates are being closed through paying off governments such as Turkey, even Libyan warlords, to keep these refugees away from Europe. So it's about fear of the other and using that fear to have power over you. So by making secularism in the region will not remove the root reasons of the inequality, desperation, and what is happening in the Middle East, because it is connected to what is happening in Europe and elsewhere in the world.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we'll just wrap it up there. I am interested to know if our speakers have any final comments before we wrap up the discussion. Any last bits to add or anything? It's okay if you don't.
I want to add something to what Emad have said, because I totally agree with him. It's a structure. It's an international structure of power and fear. I don't think that it's an Islamophobia as much as it's the fear of a brown man that is also the other. I think that if the vast majority of Islam were blonde with blue eyes, maybe they were being afraid of something else that comes from the Middle East and looks a bit different and speaks a different language. Now, but to add to this, I would like to, because you talked about the liberals too. So yes, I think that in Europe and in the West, there are some that will look at Israel as more alike. We're speaking maybe in the same language. We are a democracy. Half of us is from Europe. I mean, we are a state of immigrants. For example, I am British. Did you know that? I mean, when you're talking about me, you can say, I am British.
Wait, you're British?
I am. I didn't get a passport. My mom and sister did, but I am. I'm also Yemeni. So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, Israel is new state. We're a democracy, and we have lots of people that coming from Europe. And yet Israel is not part of NATO. Turkey is, but Europeans will not look at Turkey as part of Europe. Let's face it. They look at us as almost part of Europe. So this is one way. But if you're looking at, but it's not just that, because if you look at most of my lefty friends around the world, they will be very proud that they are, every week demonstrating in front of the Israeli embassy for what we're doing to the Palestinians. But even when Western people are choosing who to care about when it comes to the Middle East, they choose the Palestinians. I'm not saying it because I don't think that you should care about the Palestinians, but I'm looking at why are we choosing the Palestinians and not, for example, the Yemenis. Emad quoted some numbers about the amount of weapons that the UK sells to Saudi Arabia. These weapons are being used against civilians in Yemen on a daily basis, and yet there are no weekly demonstration in front of the Ministry of Trade, Foreign Affairs, Security in the UK, where you can actually make a difference about selling weapons and that actually are being used against civilians. So even when Europeans are choosing who to care about in the Middle East, they're choosing the one that is connected to the Israelis. So even this kind of looking is there's a lot of prejudice here. That's what I'm trying to say. When it's time to look at the Middle East just like any other place, to look at people from the Middle East just like any other place. We see people talk about regional security for the Middle East. We in the Middle East don't know what regional security means. I mean, at METO, where we deal with regional security for the Middle East, we're trying to find out what does it mean, because there is no answer to what is security to the Middle East, for example. So I think that when it comes to prejudice, even when leftists and those who were supposed to look at us just like any other person are talking to us, they still have prejudice. Even those who think that they can just come and solve the Middle East, as if, and if you're British, for example, and you think you can solve the Middle East and ask, what can we do to help? When we answer, well, if you're British, lead by example, people think that it's rude. But why would you think that you can disarm the Middle East if you don't know how to disarm your own country? And look at how many discussions are there in nuclear armed states about how to solve a different state that is not theirs, but somehow they think they can solve it. So my problem is not when right-wingers are dealing with the Middle East in prejudice, but it's when leftists are.
Amazing. I think Emad wanted one final comment, and then
I promise you, last one. Okay, everybody listen up. I get 1 minute for this. It's not all gloom and doom, okay? The whole idea of this whole exercise is that there is a way forward. That's the Middle East Treaty Organization, and within academia, within civil society, within these government allies, we have ways to move forward. So if you want to learn more, go to WMD-free.me. Find out how you can volunteer, do the internship, join the Middle East Treaty Organization University Network. If you somehow, as a student or somebody else, or you know, has a lot of money, donate. I mean, there's many ways you can do this, but also educate yourself, advocate, learn about power, influence, greed, profit, and how you can dismantle it, reverse engineer it into something different, and look into the future. That being said, I wish I was there with you in person, but let me just give a final example of power, and that is my brown self applied for a British visa, and the British kept my passport for 5 months in, what is that, Liverpool or London, one of those places. And they finally returned it to me when I asked for it. I got my passport back. Thank you very much, British government, but without a visa. And so that being said, I want you to know, and my partner, by the way, is British, to let you know that this is happening in 2022 when I'm applying as a South African, which was a former colony of the British. As they say in Israel, the chutzpah for these people to not give us the visa to come to the land of milk and honey, aka not UK, but that's how they sold it to the rest of the world when they occupied and colonized. So don't believe those lies, keep to the truth, remember to work with compassion. And I know it sounds cheesy, but love is important because that can bring down the barriers and let us see what is common between us. That if you cut me and you cut you, the blood will be red. I assure you, it's not going to be green or blue. So lots of love, and I hope that we will be all in contact in the near future.
And Emad, just one thing to mention, that SOAS is actually leading on those principles, well known in the United Kingdom and the world. And our students, when they graduate, they are our ambassadors. So they do that. Also, SOAS was the hub of pro-EU during the so-called Brexit referendum. So, yeah, we all voted to remain, but anyway, so.
Ali, don't worry, I will come and see you the moment we have SOAS take over this government, for heaven's sake.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for your great insight. I think we've come to an end right now. Thank you also to Emad for having already mentioned the fact that students can be part of METO, be part of a change of an improve through internships, volunteer, also be part of our university network of which me and Zemal are. There are plenty of opportunities and projects that we are running to that we want to create as well. So be in touch with us through our social medias, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, which is WMD Free Zone. That's it. And thank you so much for coming. Thank you also to
you for organizing this.
make an applause for everyone.
Thank you so much to our speakers as well. And thank you for coming. Yeah.